all with their stories to tell, and the local news media at the back with their cameras rolling, and there in the middle, trapped in a little sunken bit of courtyard, was the council leader, surrounded by children who were able to say, "This is what we want, will you help us?" And he couldn't but say, "Yeah, okay, whatever you want." And I think what I think is important about that kind of story, it's not as powerful a change as sorting out universal credit, but those kids came away from that experience saying, "We met the council leader. We achieved the change we wanted in our streets. We've made the world a better place." And they will grow up thinking, we can change the world. And from that little change story involving a few footpaths and a few bridges, you've begun to build the capacity to do something bigger. And I think that's one of the things we felt. The more we work together as an alliance in our city, the more ambitious we can become, and the more difference we can achieve for the people who most need change. Thank you.
One of the things I love about that story is that those children were the ones who said to the council leader what should happen. So often, I think, in the church, I used to say the role of the church is to be a voice for the voiceless. But what I've discovered is that isn't the role of the church at all. The role of the church is to help the voiceless find their voice. And that is also the role of the deanery, I think. How do you as a deanery, how do you work together with not just yourselves, but other people in your local community, like Tim discussed, to collectively have a voice and talk about what are the issues that you care about? Because the church at its best is talking about those issues that are relevant to the people in its local community. And maybe it's universal credit. Maybe it's the issue of housing. Maybe it's asylum seekers. But as soon as we lose our relevance with people, we're in trouble. And even though it starts from kind of small beginnings, there is also the possibility of bringing people together across a bigger geography and making larger change. So yes, you might start by saying, what can I do about the local footpaths? Or what can I do? I recently ran a campaign with a bunch of young people who said they felt unsafe and they wanted to do something on it was a crossing in Lewisham. Actually, it was a crossing that went from one school to the other side, and there were no lights. And children said that they just felt really unsafe, and would the council work to get some lighting up? Sometimes it can be those small things. And the great thing about that is, yes, it's about the change, but it's also about bringing people together. It's about the relationships that you build. It's about the potential and opportunity that grows from those relationships to do things together. And it strikes me that so often what we do is, when we want to make change, we write an email to somebody to come to something rather than just go and visit them. We send a flyer to somebody rather than knock on their door. This work is all about face-to-face meeting, bringing people together, sharing their stories and finding the things that they want to change. And in the lead up to one of the general elections, I say one of them because there's been so many recently, haven't there? We discovered in a lot of our Catholic churches and some of our Anglican churches as well, and some of our mosques, that one of the issues that was pertinent to people who were struggling with immigration issues is that children were being locked up in detention centres. You remember recently it obviously came to light in the States that they were locking children up. Well, in this country we used to do that as well. Children were locked up in immigration detention centres for months at a time. And as we heard these stories, we realized that for, like the person that you talked about, it's impossible almost for them to tell their own story because they're terrified of what might happen. But also, actually, if we're honest, nobody really cares because they don't vote. Which is a tragedy. But actually, if that person has relationships with other people, then what's possible grows. And that relational power, that sense of the ability to act also grows. And so as we went across the country meeting more and more people who were telling these stories, we realized we had an opportunity to do something. And so teams of people from churches and mosques and synagogues and universities collected together, and they went to go and see their MPs in the lead up to the general election. And they asked them simply, would you do something about ending child detention? Now, it wasn't on anyone's radar, it wasn't in anyone's policy documents, it was in nobody's manifesto, because nobody cared about it, because it wasn't an issue that was hot. But we made it hot. And if you make it hot for long enough, you can't sit on it anymore. And we made it hot. And so MPs started to call the prime ministerial candidates, which are Gordon Brown and David Cameron, and say, if you become Prime Minister, we've just met a bunch of people from our local constituency of churches, some people affected by the issue and others not, working together to say we need to do something about this. I didn't know anything about it, but if you become Prime Minister, will you do something? Some people affected by the issue and others not, working together to say we need to do something about this. I didn't know anything about it, but if you become Prime Minister, will you do something? That work. And then we gathered all these people from across the UK together. It was a few days before the general election. I think it was the 1st of May, maybe. And we were in Methodist Central Hall in London. Anyone been there? Yeah. Lovely, huge venue. Seats about 2,500 people. And there were people from across the country working with Citizens UK, people affected by the issues that we were talking about. And we'd invited the 3 prime ministerial candidates to come. And they'd all agreed. And they came that evening, and one of my friends who was, I was at Bible college with, he was welcoming David Cameron onto the stage, and just before he came on the stage, I think it was him, he reminded David Cameron of the issues. And he said, just remember, you're going to be asked about the living wage, which is a campaign that Citizens started again in churches, at the back of churches with people talking about it. You're going to be asked about affordable housing, and you're also going to be asked about ending child detention. Apparently at that point, David Cameron's face went white because he realised he'd not yet said anything about it. He realised it wasn't in a manifesto anywhere, but he was going to be asked by 2,500 people in a big church in the middle of London what he thought about it. So he walked on stage, and he was asked by a parent of a child who'd been locked up, if you become the Prime Minister of this country, will you end child detention? And you can look at it on YouTube, actually. You can see that he pauses. And in that moment, what David Cameron is doing, he's not thinking about the moral argument, although maybe he had been swayed by the stories and the testimonies of people who've been affected by the issue, but he's doing a power analysis. What do I have to gain? What do I have to lose? There's 2,500 people sat here, but they're all connected to local constituencies across the country, and we've got an election coming up. I do remember something about a few MPs telling me now about constituencies that were fighting for this and wanted to make it happen. That could be a lot of votes. And also, there was a camera. The BBC were filming it. So it was going out to the whole country. And in that moment, David Cameron looks into the camera and he says, if I become Prime Minister, I will end child detention. And he was true to his word. I don't know if you were part of those delegations, Tim, that met with him afterwards. And Nick Clegg, because it was a coalition, you remember, it was after the 2010 election. And they were true to their word, and they created legislation that ended child detention. Now, there's lots of fights still to have when it comes to immigration. We've just started a campaign about passports. Passports cost £1,100 to buy, which if you're a family of 4 and you don't have enough money to put food on the table, buying a passport for £1,100 is an awful lot of money, and you actually have to choose between which child is going to get a passport and which one isn't, even though you're allowed to be in this country and have a right to remain. So we started that. So there's other things that we need to do, but it is possible. It's possible locally if you work together and I know it's difficult. Even just getting local churches to come and agree together is sometimes hard, isn't it, to find a common cause or a common good. But if you start by building relationships, if you start with people, if you start by listening to people's stories, it's possible. Just in Croydon North Deanery, I was there last week. For a long time they were kind of thinking about, what do we do together? What's our kind of raison d'etre as a deanery? And they looked at the issue of young people, and they said, well, we've all got young people in our churches, but we don't feel that it's necessarily as relevant for young people as it should be. How do we make it more relevant? And we don't have the resource to be able to do anything on our own. But maybe if we work together, we could do something. So they started something called Public Spirit. And I went to the first meeting last week, which was young people, youth volunteers, the area dean, local vicars that wanted to do something about it, all saying, what could we do together? Because on our own, we can't tackle the issues that young people face. But if we work together, young